Howdy folks, hope you've all enjoyed your weekend, and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. First, I'll get the obligatory thank yous out of the way at the start. Thank you, of course, to everybody who supports me on Patreon. Thanks to you guys. Every episode of Mingles with Jingles is advert-free. And also, thank you to the, at last count, 149 of you who have chosen to support me by subscribing on Floatplane. I hope you're enjoying your glorious HD video content. Safe and secure in the knowledge that since the platform is entirely advert-free and supported by subscriptions, you don't have to watch any advertising, and YouTube doesn't make any money out of you, so it's all good. So, all kind of different things that I wanted to talk about this week. First, was it in last week's episode? I think it was last week, and I'm too lazy to check, but somebody asked the question, what kind of hobbies do I wish that I'd either gotten into in the first place or kept doing over the years? And it was a great question. And my answer to that question was drawing, and I showed you some scans from my easily more than 30-year-old high school sketchbook, and miniature painting. Because when I was in high school, I was heavily into Warhammer Fantasy Battle and Warhammer 40,000. My problem was I could never figure out which armies to use. I think the very first army that I got, and this was in the mid-1980s, so I think 2nd edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle Rules, was a Wood Elf army. And I liked my Wood Elves. But then I was in Games Workshop in town on a Saturday. I spent most Saturdays in Games Workshop in town in Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England. And I spotted this model Elven Dragon Rider, complete with dragon, obviously, and it was the most amazing model I'd ever seen, so I could barely afford it, but I snapped it up, took it home, put it together. I mean, this was a heavy model. This was back in the day when Citadel Miniatures were making things out of metal rather than plastic. So this was a substantial piece of kit. Got it painted, not very well. I got better, but yeah. And then, of course, I couldn't use it because it turns out it was for a High Elf army. And none of my friends would let me use it against them in a Wood Elf army because, you know, those are the bloody rules. So anyway, then I started building up a High Elf army, and I finally got to use this dragon. The only problem was it was an extremely expensive, as far as its points value is concerned. So you could have this dragon, but you couldn't have an awful lot else in your army. And I don't think, in all the games that I played with it, I don't think I ever killed anything with this dragon, because the second it appeared on the battlefield, it just got focused the shit out of it. Anything that could shoot it, shot at it. Anything that could cast a spell at it. The only thing it ever really seemed to do was just tie down huge numbers of enemy troops, killing it. So, you know, there was that. Totally the least useful thing I ever bought for playing Warhammer Fantasy Battle. I have some great memories of getting together with friends on a Saturday or a Sunday and just fighting each other's armies, playing at first Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and then when it was released, Warhammer 40,000. I don't know what things are like these days. I mean, in the last week or so I've been spending quite some time watching YouTube videos of people playing the modern version of Warhammer 40,000 and Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and things have changed quite a bit. But one thing that I can clearly remember was back in the day, I mean, Games Workshop produced some amazing miniatures. They produced some absolutely terrible miniatures as well, but the quality of the craftsmanship was generally pretty good. But they couldn't balance the game for shit. I remember when they first introduced Chaos armies. And my friend Kirk was the first one to get the Realms of Chaos sourcebook and actually put a Chaos army together. Just hordes of beastmen and Chaos warriors with a couple of Chaos champions, and I think I was the first one to fight him. Now, at the time, I'd put together a Britannian army. Now, the Britannians were basically medieval French knights, so a Britannian army consisted of a couple of large units of conscripted militia, basically peasants with spears, mercenary crossbowmen, and lots and lots of mounted heavy cavalry. They were basically the French armies of the 14th and 15th centuries. And they were pretty tough. when I got this cavalry into charge range, they just crushed everything that they ran into. They were seriously good units, and seriously expensive units to field as well. Seriously expensive miniatures too. That's one thing that hasn't changed as far as Games Workshop is concerned. The prices that they charge for their stuff will make your eyes water. More on that later. Anyway, Realms of Chaos came out. Kirk was the first of my friends to actually get himself a Chaos army together. So hordes of beastmen and Chaos warriors, backed up by a couple of Chaos champions. The thing is, it may be the same now, it may be different, I don't know. With your Chaos champions, you could roll random mutations for them, which could give them some pretty powerful abilities. And Kirk's Chaos champion caused fear. I mean, he had such horrible mutations that the mere sight of him was enough to cause a unit to flee in terror. So one weekend, Kirk and I met at our friend John's house. John had an Orc and Goblin army, but he also had a massive gaming table, and we needed a big table to play on. I mean, when you're fielding an army with 40 armoured cavalry on it, you need a big table. So we meet at John's place. I set my army up, Kirk sets his army up. We're all going, ooh, you know, because most of us had never actually seen a Chaos army before. This was the first time, as far as I can remember, that any of us had played either as one or against one. So we're all admiring Kirk's army, and he was a fairly talented artist as well. They were all very well painted. He was way better than I was. And then once we'd gotten over the newness of it all, we deployed our armies and game on. Didn't take long at all for me to get my armoured cavalry within charging distance, and pretty soon I'm cleaving through units of beastmen, scattering everything before me, and then I ran into Kirk's Chaos champion. And he just kind of went, blah! And the flower of Britannian chivalry ran off the battlefield. They all failed their fear check, routed, and then they kept failing their leadership checks, and the entire army just routed off the battlefield. And that left me with one unit of crossbowmen and two rather large mobs of peasants armed with spears, standing alone against the hordes of chaos. Let's just say it didn't end well. So Kirk and John both had a great laugh at my expense. Cue all the jokes about the French running away. Yeah, I know. My protests of righteous indignation that one fucking unit shouldn't be able to effectively wipe out 75% of my army fell on deaf ears. John promised that the next week he would show me how it was done. So the next week we met back at John's place, and John fielded his massive and extremely well painted Orc and Goblin army. Now the thing about having an Orc and Goblin army back then, and remember this is in the mid-80s, I think this was second or maybe third edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle Rules, was that Orcs and Goblins tend to have low leadership scores. So as the general, you can make your plan for what you want them to do, but once they, get stuck into the swing of things, once their blood's up, it can be very difficult to make them do what you want them to do. And there was a rule that if a unit was routing, if a unit broke in combat and started to run away, you would have to do a leadership check for every unit, I think within 12 inches of that unit, who saw them routing. And then if they failed that leadership check, they would start to rout as well. And then any unit within 12 inches of them would have to do a leadership, and so on and so on. So if one unit routed in an Orc and Goblin army, it could cause a chain reaction. But, if you played with Orcs and Goblins, you were used to this. You were kind of used to your armies just running around and doing whatever the hell they wanted to do. So the idea that some of his troops might rout if they came into contact with Kirk's Chaos Champion didn't scare John, because he was an Orc player. And so he was used to coping with this. And he was confident that he could take on the hordes of chaos. Well, John was wrong. Because the greenskin hordes crashed upon the rock that was Kirk's Chaos Champion and came off second best. And most of his army routed off the battlefield as well, and those that didn't were slaughtered by the hordes of chaos. So word started to get around. I mean, Kirk had already just completely humiliated my Britannian army, and he'd wiped the floor with John's Orc and Goblin army, and John didn't lose battles often. So all the rest of our friends started queuing up to take on Kirk's Chaos army and beat him and claim bragging rights over everybody that Kirk's army had humiliated. Our friend Jonathan had to go with his Empire army and got his arse kicked 7 different ways to Sunday. Our friend Martin had to go with his Wood Elf army and got absolutely slaughtered. Our friend Terry had to go with his Dark Elf army, and the results were not pretty. And the one common feature in this unbroken string of victories was Kirk's fucking Chaos champion. Some of the battles were a lot closer than my absolute humiliating rout of a defeat, but every single time, whenever the critical juncture appeared in the battle, Kirk would just roll up this Chaos champion, and from that point on, forget it. There was nothing you could do. It wasn't just that he caused fear and routed all the units around him. He was also a double rock-hard bastard killing machine who slaughtered everything around him that didn't run away in fear and was next to impossible to kill. Pretty soon the joke became, and I say joke, not meme, because these were the 1980s. Memes hadn't been invented back then, and even if they had, we probably wouldn't have been able to afford them. But the joke was that Kirk's Chaos Champion just kind of sat in this tent at the back of the battlefield, and any time it looked like things were going badly for the armies of Chaos, he would just stick his face out of the tent, go blah, rout a couple of units, and then go back to whatever he was doing in the tent. I must point out, by the way, Kirk was not a bad player. Right? It wasn't just that he had this ridiculously overpowered unit in his army, and that's why he kept winning. He was also a fairly good player, but he was a fairly good player with a ridiculously overpowered unit in his army, and he never lost a battle. Eventually, Kirk just stopped playing his Chaos army, for a combination of 2 reasons. One, he was actually getting genuinely embarrassed about how easy the victories were with this army, and 2, people just stopped playing against him. Nobody ever took on Kirk's Chaos army more than once. You'd play it against it once, you'd get your arse whipped, and then you just throw your hands up in disgust at an official rule system that allowed an army to contain one character that was so ridiculously powerful that it would routinely be entirely capable of taking on and beating half of your army by itself. The thing is, none of us had the slightest idea what the rest of the Warhammer community thought about the Chaos armies and the Realms of Chaos expansion. Because don't forget, this was before the internet. It's not like today, where if World of Warships introduces a new modification upgrade that single-handedly nerfs the entire Pan-Asian destroyer line, more on that in a moment, you can jump onto the official forums and whine about it all day long. There was no Reddit back in the 80s where you could start a flame war about how stupidly overpowered and broken this new rule set was. The only form of communication that we had was whining all over each other at a local Games Workshop, or writing letters, because yes, people still wrote letters back then, to Games Workshop's White Dwarf magazine. But that was Games Workshop's own magazine. They weren't going to print letters that were, openly critical of their latest and greatest rule system. I suspect, however, that most people had the same opinions as us. I have no idea how well balanced the game is these days, although I suspect much more so, since it's incredibly easy these days for people to complain very loudly and often about things that are stupidly broken and overpowered. But one thing that definitely hasn't changed when I made the decision to get back into miniature painting as a hobby. I'm not going to be playing the battles. I'm basically just going to be collecting the miniatures that I like the look of, and I'm going to start painting them up again. And I think I'm probably going to be filming myself doing it, so you can all have a little laugh at my lack of skill. But one thing that definitely hasn't changed is the eye-watering prices that Games Workshop are charging for their stuff. I mean, I thought things were bad when I was a teenager. I had a part-time job working in a bar on the weekends. And do you remember that dragon, the Elven dragon rider that I told you about? I think it took me 4 weeks to save up in order to buy that model. At the time, it was the biggest and most expensive model that Games Workshop produced, and it cost me £24. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but I did some investigating. I found an inflation calculator, and according to the British Office of National Statistics, £24 in mid-1980s money is worth around about £100 today. So yeah, that was an expensive model, but it was 100% metal. I mean, you could feel the weight of the money that went into this thing. Now, just before I joined the Navy and stopped collecting and painting, Games Workshop were moving from all metal miniatures to miniatures that included plastic parts, usually the arms and the backpacks and the heads of the miniatures. The rest of the body, the torso and the legs, were usually still all metal. Now, the advantage to this, as Games Workshop were very keen to point out, and to be fair to them, it's absolutely true, previously, when you're buying a blister pack of figures, so one pack with 5 figures in them, and they're all made out of metal, you can't adjust them. You can't customize their look. They are what they are. On the other hand, if you've got a blister pack of 5 figures and you've got 5 legs with torsos attached and then a whole bunch of interchangeable arms and weapons and heads and backpacks, there's more customization options available. Games Workshop were very keen to point this out when they announced that they were moving from all metal miniatures to combination metal and plastic accessory miniatures, and this was absolutely true. But we were more keen in the cost savings, because it's cheaper to make miniatures that aren't one massive solid lump of metal. Also, we thought. And I can remember going into Games Workshop one Saturday, because we knew they were getting the new miniatures in, and being outraged at seeing that they were exactly the same price, despite the fact that they were 40% plastic, exactly the same price as the older miniatures, which were 100% metal. So when I thought to myself, you know what, I should get back into miniature painting, and I went to Games Workshop's website and started looking at the prices. Holy fuck. Today, the miniatures are 100% plastic, and their prices will make your eyes water. Do you remember that Elven Dragon Rider I told you about? Citadel Miniatures' biggest and most expensive model in the mid-80s when I bought it, which translated to around about a £100 spend in today's money on a model. Yeah, but it was all metal, right? You can still spend more than £100 if you go to the Games Workshop website. It's entirely possible to spend way more than £100 on a single model today. But they're not made of metal. They're 100% plastic, and they're still as expensive as the most expensive metal miniature was 30 years ago. Somehow, despite the fact that Games Workshop is no longer a struggling niche hobby shop with half a dozen shops throughout the UK, casting miniatures out of expensive metal, and is now an international success story with hundreds of stores in dozens of countries able to utilise economies of scale to mass produce cheap plastic miniatures, somehow they're still charging the same prices. So if there's one thing that absolutely hasn't changed in the intervening 30 years, it's just how far Games Workshop are prepared to go to rip off their customers. Just as one further example, as if more were needed, of how ridiculously expensive Games Workshop are. When it comes to just decorating the base of your miniature, the piece of plastic that the miniature stands on, you don't have to decorate the base, but, well, a decorated base looks better than just a piece of black plastic. Games Workshop will sell you a whole bunch of different basing supplies. One of them is called Midland Tufts, and they're basically just clumps of fake grass that you can glue to the miniature base and then paint around and so on and so on. And they look really good. One pack of these will cost you £10. For the same money, you can go to Amazon, just do a search for model scenery, and get a pack of 8 different kinds of scenery materials. Sand, gravel, rocks, lichen, moss, and the same amount of these tufts. So you're getting 8 times as much different kinds of basing materials on Amazon for exactly the same price. So no, I'm not going to be collecting and painting huge armies. Not just because the prices are ridiculous, but also because I just don't have anywhere to put them. Instead, I'm going to be just picking out miniatures that I like the look of, painting them up, maybe making dioramas out of them, and sticking them in display cases. Just for fun. And I'll be almost certainly filming myself doing it. A couple of other things caught my eye this week. World of Warships fans, I don't know if you have heard, but the news was posted on Reddit. Super test changes to ship upgrades. Now, personally, I think that this is something that has been needed for a while. When we say ship upgrades, we're talking about things like fire control modification, target acquisition systems, all of the optional extras that you can fit to your ship to enhance their abilities. Some of these upgrades were nigh on useless. Anti-aircraft gun modification 1 being a particular culprit. It actually used to be really good. Back in 2018, before the aircraft carrier rework, it extended the range of your anti-aircraft guns, which meant that attacking aircraft were coming under anti-aircraft fire for longer. And it was a very good upgrade, but then the aircraft carrier rework hit, and instead it was reworked to generate extra flak explosions, only produced by your long and medium range, well, and in fact now only your long range anti-aircraft guns. So it's basically a complete waste of money because you can dodge flak. This one, for example, is being changed to give you a 20% reduction to your priority AA sector preparation time. So you know when aircraft are coming in, you just look in the direction where you can see the aircraft and you press the O key, and it concentrates the anti-aircraft fire on that side of the ship. But then it has a cooldown. So you often can't get it back up again if the aircraft go overhead and attack from the other side. Well, with this 20% reduction in the preparation time, you probably will be able to get it back up again to re-engage aircraft attacking from the opposite side. So that's really good. Other changes include taking 2 existing modules, both of which were not 100% useless, and getting rid of them and instead combining their effects into one. For example, where is it? The brand new Auxiliary Armament Mod 1, which basically combines AA Gun Mod 2 and Secondary Battery Mod 2 all in the same module for the price of one. So, yay, fantastic stuff. There are other changes which look really good, but when you stop to think about it, I mean, they are good, but the implications are kind of worrying. What we're talking about here is the brand new Torpedo Protection System. Now, this replaces the Target Acquisition System mod, which was a mod that nobody ever used because it went in the same slot as your concealment system, and concealment was just way better. So this new upgrade does 2 things. First, it adds 5% to your torpedo protection, which basically means you take 5% less damage from torpedoes, so this is good. The other thing that it does, and I'm quoting directly here, allows for torpedoes to be detected at a fixed distance of 1.8 kilometers, regardless of the torpedo's detectability range, and this can also be further improved with the captain's skill, Vigilance. Well, that's great, isn't it? It is, unless you like playing Pan-Asian destroyers. Pan-Asian destroyers haven't really been in a great place in World of Warships for a while now, mostly because of what wargaming did to the Tier 10, the Yu Yang. Quite a while back, the Yu Yang at Tier 10 had its guns and its torpedoes nerfed, and we're in a really strange situation now where the Tier 9 is way better than the Tier 10. If you've gone to Tier 9 in the Pan-Asian destroyer line and you've got the Chungmu, there is no incentive whatsoever for you to grind out the Tier 10, the Yu Yang, because the Chungmu has better guns, it has better torpedoes, it's faster, and it's got better stealth. So I don't know what they were thinking when they nerfed the Yu Yang, but it's made the entire Pan-Asian destroyer line kind of pointless because it leads to the worst Tier 10 destroyer in the game. And I say that knowing that the Z-52 exists. And the new Starashimi. But anyway, yeah. This modification change is a massive kick in the balls for Pan-Asian destroyers because their only real unique selling point is their deep water torpedoes. They have torpedoes that can only hit ships with a large draft. which basically means you can't torpedo other destroyers. You can only use the torpedoes against cruisers, battleships, and aircraft carriers. The upside is that the torpedoes, because they run deep, they have a very, very low detection range, 0.8 kilometers. Unless somebody's using the torpedo protection system, where they get detected an entire kilometer earlier. So, yay, Pan-Asian destroyers. Yet another nail in their coffin. It's not really going to help you against Japanese destroyers that tend to have at least 1.8 kilometer or more detection range on their torpedoes anyway. It's not going to help you that much against American destroyers. The Gearing, for example, has torpedoes that will be spotted from 1.4 kilometers away, so you get an extra 400 meters warning. Yeah, fantastic. But it basically kicks the shit out of Pan-Asian destroyers, whose only real gimmick is the fact that their torpedoes are so incredibly sneaky. Well, except not anymore. So, you know, GG for that. And by the way, Wargaming have no plans whatsoever to change the functionality of this upgrade that's currently on Super Test. They're perfectly happy with it, regardless of what it means to Pan-Asian destroyer players. Another thing that happened this week that had me staring at World of Warships, shaking my head and just thinking, what the fuck were you thinking? I mean, as if the whole Puerto Rico thing wasn't bad enough, was to do with the introduction of British heavy cruisers. One thing that World of Warships does like to do, anytime they introduce a new line of ships, in this case British heavy cruisers, they like to give you a way of shortcutting your way to some of the ships. It's usually the tier 5, 6, 7 and 8, and there's no change this time around. Although what has changed is the way you get that shortcut. Now, in the past, it's usually been, well, they introduce a new line of ships, they introduce a new directive to go with that line of ships, and usually what will happen is there are various different containers associated with that directive, and when you open one of the containers, whether you bought that container from the premium shop, or you bought the container from the in-game armory using tokens, or you completed directives and were given containers as rewards, but when you open one of those containers, there's a chance that you might get a bonus mission for one of the new ships. You complete the mission just by playing the game, and bingo, you got yourself one of the brand new ships. That's the way they've done it in the past, with minor variations. It's not the way they're doing it this time. And I suspect the reason why they're not doing it that way this time is because of the whole stigma associated with loot boxes. Yes, thank you, Star Wars Battlefront 2. In certain countries, Belgium being probably the most notable example, loot boxes have been declared to be a form of gambling, because they are a form of gambling. And if you don't want to have your game rated adults only, you can't have loot boxes. So Belgian players are not able to buy loot boxes from the premium store. Bearing this in mind, I think that's probably the reason why Wargaming have gone with this new method of getting the shortcut to the British heavy cruisers. Probably because they want to stay away from this whole loot box thing and its association with gambling, and also because it means that they can include players from Belgium and other countries that have declared loot boxes to be gambling. They can also take part in this whole shortcut procedure, which is what makes it all the more baffling, because what they've done is they've taken away the loot boxes and they've replaced it with something, because, you know, loot boxes looked an awful lot like gambling, but they've replaced it with something that absolutely, definitely, 100% is gambling. The new procedure is this. You go to the in-game armory and you look for the British Heavy Cruisers tab. And then you've got two different ways of gambling on getting a British Heavy Cruiser. You can either use the in-game tokens, which is fine because it doesn't actually cost you anything. You earn them from just playing the game and completing the British Heavy Cruiser directives. And a set amount of tokens buys you a press of the big red button that may or may not give you a British Heavy Cruiser. There's a list of what you might get. Consumables, flags, British Heavy Cruisers. But each time you press the button, it's in the lap of the gods. You might get consumables, you might get flags, you might get one of the ships. Eventually, if you hit the button enough and spend enough tokens, you'll get all of the ships. But if you don't have enough tokens, or you can't be arsed grinding them, you can just throw money at the problem. Because the other method is by spending 1,000 gold per shot to hit that big red button. This is exactly the same as putting money into a slot machine. And this is what amazes me, because they've taken a system, loot boxes, and maybe getting a bonus mission that would get you a ship from the loot box, a system that looked an awful lot like gambling, a system that in fact in certain countries has been legally ruled to be gambling, and they've done away with that system, and instead they've introduced something where you put money into the armory and you press a button and you might get a ship, or you might get some flags and consumables. But if you keep pressing the button by putting more money into it, eventually, at some point, you're going to get the ship. And believe it or not, that, kids, depending on how much vodka you've had for breakfast, looks less like gambling than loot boxes. Well, actually, Jingles, nobody's putting money into anything here. What are you talking about? Gold isn't free. It's not free, but it's not money either. Have you ever wondered why all of these games have their own in-game currency? I mean, taking a stab at the one-armed bandit British heavy cruiser generator costs 1,000 gold per go. But it costs 1,000 gold. It doesn't cost £3 per go. It doesn't cost $2 per go. And there's a very good reason for that, because we as consumers in most societies tend to have certain rights under law when it comes to things that we've spent actual money on. So, for example, you buy something and it doesn't work. You have the right to a return. If it doesn't do what you expected it to do, based on how it was advertised to you, or it's just flat out broken, you can return it and expect a refund. But if you've just spent the whole morning pigging away at the 1,000 gold per shot random British heavy cruiser generator and not actually gotten a British heavy cruiser yet, you have no right under law to ask for a refund of the money that you spent to buy the gold that you used, because the gold did exactly what it was supposed to do. The gold, which is what you actually spent money on, worked just fine, exactly as advertised. If you had 10 attempts at getting a British heavy cruiser with the gold and didn't get one, that's not the gold's fault. You got your money's worth out of the gold, even if you feel ripped off. That's exactly why so many of these online games have their own virtual currencies and things in the games that can only be bought with the virtual currency and not an actual currency, because then you don't have any recourse under law. The money that was handed over at the point of sale was used to buy the virtual currency, and the virtual currency works exactly as advertised, and you got exactly what you paid for. Anyway, hopefully there's plenty there in this week's episode to keep you occupied in the comments section. Do let me know what you think about anything that we've covered in this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. Once again, thank you to all my Patreon supporters and Floatplane subscribers. Hope you've all had a good weekend. Not just my Patreon supporters and Floatplane subscribers. I hope you've all of you, had a good weekend and a good week to come. And as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.